The mist clung to the hollows of the Cascade Mountains like a shroud, dampening the scent of pine and decaying leaves. Cal moved through it, a ghost in earth tones. Each footfall was deliberate, placing weight softly, testing the give of the forest floor. He wasn't tracking so much as sovereignty becoming of the forest, mirroring its stillness, predicting its whispers. An elk, a mature bull, judging by the size of the prints, moving parallel to the creek. He hadn't needed to read the sign for years, not since. Well, since it was ingrained now. A reflex honed by necessity. He checked the wind, a slight push from the northwest, carrying his scent far away from the game. Good, he raised the Remington 760, the cold steel familiar against his cheek. The crosshairs settled on the animal's broad shoulder. He didn't rush it. Rushing blurred the edges, invited mistakes. He breathed slow, deliberately matching the rhythm of the forest. In out the elk was oblivious, nosing through the undergrowth, its breath steaming in the cold air. He squeezed the trigger. The report cracked through the silence, echoing between the trees. The elk dropped as if poleaxed, a shudder running through its massive frame. Cal didn't watch it fall. He already knew. He moved to the kill, not with triumph, but with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. This wasn't sport. It was sustenance. It was control. The butchering was swift, efficient. He worked with a bone. Handled knife he carried for over a decade. Each cut precise, minimizing waste. He learned the hard way that out here. Nothing could be wasted. He quartered the elk, securing the meat in heavy canvas bags. The work occupied his hands, his focus. It was a necessary anchor. As he worked, memories flickered around the edges of his awareness, unwanted guests at a carefully curated solitude. Sand heat, the metallic tang of blood. The faces, God, the faces. He pushed them back down, deeper. He wouldn't let them surface. Not now, not ever. He was Captain Callum, Callis, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, a decorated officer, discharged under, let's call it, ambiguous circumstances. He hadn't argued. Arguments were exhausting. Best to just disappear, to become a shadow in the green. 8 years. 8 years he'd been living off the grid in this isolated corner of Washington state. A small, hand-built cabin, miles from the nearest road. No phone, no internet, no contact. Just him and the trees. He'd chosen this place deliberately. Remote, rugged. A place where a man could lose himself and maybe, just maybe, find a sliver of peace. But peace was a fragile thing. He finished securing the last of the meat. The sun was beginning to dip below the peaks, casting long, ominous shadows. He needed to get back. He shouldered the heavy pack, the weight grounding him. He started his trek back toward the cabin, his senses on high alert. Something was off. It wasn't anything he could pinpoint, not exactly. Just a feeling, an unsettling stillness. The forest was thinned away, still alive, even at night, filled with the rustle of small creatures, the hoot of owls, the creak of branches. But today it was muted, suspended. He stopped, listening. Nothing. The silence was a pressure in his ears, a weight on his chest. He scanned the trees, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock 19 holstered at his hip. Old habits died hard. He hadn't fired it in over a year, but it was clean, oiled, and ready. He dismissed it as paranoia. It was a familiar companion. Trauma had a way of rewiring the brain, making shadows dance and whispers sound like threats. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He altered his route slightly, pushing deeper into the woods than he usually went. An old logging trail, overgrown and rarely used. He rarely ventured this far, no need to. He had everything he needed closer to the cabin. But today, he felt compelled, drawn. It was then he saw it. A rickety wooden structure, partially obscured by the trees. A hunting stand. Not the permanent, well-maintained kind. This one looked abandoned, forgotten, rotting wood, rusted metal. The platform sagged precariously. He approached cautiously, his Glock drawn now. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, unfamiliar scent, not animal, not human, something else. Something artificial. He cataloged it, filed it away. He didn't recognize it. He climbed the weathered ladder, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. The wood groaned in protest. The platform was small, barely large enough for one person. It offered a clear view of the surrounding forest. A natural surveillance point overlooking a narrow game trail. He scanned the area again, nothing, just trees and silence. But the feeling of being watched intensified. He ran a hand over the rough, hewn wood of the stand's front wall. The wood was damp, slick with moisture. Then he saw it. Carved into the wood, crudely but deliberately, was a symbol. A perfect circle with a spiral winding inward. It wasn't a hunting mark. It wasn't a surveyor. As Blaze, he'd seen enough markings in the woods to know that. This was different. It felt ancient, primal. He traced the carving with his fingertip, a cold dread creeping into his gut. He didn't recognize it, and that was the problem. He'd spent years studying survival techniques, wilderness lore, even ancient Native American symbols of the region. Nothing matched this. He painstakingly erased his past, created a new identity forged in solitude. He thought he escaped. He thought he was safe. But this symbol felt like a violation, like a crack in the carefully constructed walls of his isolation. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the woods into a deeper, more menacing gloom. A twig snapped behind him. He spun around, Glock raised, his training kicking in. But there was nothing there, just the trees, just the shadows, just the silence. But this time the silence wasn't empty, it felt expectant. And then he heard it, a faint rustling in the undergrowth, moving closer, not the sound of an animal, the sound of something following him. The symbol haunted him. Even back at the cabin, the image of the spiral within the circle was burned onto his retina. He sketched it carefully in his journal, next to detailed botanical drawings and notes on animal behavior. It didn't fit. He spent the better part of the night referencing it with every resource he possessed. Books on regional Native American lore, historical surveys of the area, even obscure texts on esoteric symbols he acquired during his travels before. Everything, nothing. It wasn't a Coast Salish design, not a Chinook symbol, not even a white settler brand or marking. The lines were too deliberate, too intentional for casual vandalism. It felt thin-placed and like a marker. A warning. He brewed strong coffee. The scent a meager comfort in the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. He hadn't allowed himself the luxury of coffee for years. It was a habit from his past life, one he consciously abandoned. Today he needed something to sharpen his focus. He needed to high-think a focus. He needed to forethink, usually a source of stability. Now felt constricting, suffocating. He had to find out what that symbol meant. But where to start? He exhausted his own resources. He was a ghost, deliberately erased from the grid. Asking anyone would require revealing something of himself. A risk he wasn't willing to take. But he was running out of options. And running out of supplies. He harvested enough elk to last a few weeks. But he was low on staples, coffee, salt, sugar, ammunition. He needed to go to town. The town of Havenwood was barely more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a gas station and a diner. He hadn't been there in over 2 years. He timed his visits carefully, always avoiding peak hours, wearing nondescript clothing, and paying with cash. He'd become adept at blending into the background, at being invisible, driving the battered Ford pickup he'd acquired. Years ago, he felt exposed, vulnerable. The vehicle was another relic of his old life, painstakingly maintained and registered under a false name. He parked on the outskirts of town, choosing a spot furthest from the general store. The store was small, dusty, and smelled of pine cleaner and stale coffee. Old Man Hemlock, the owner, barely glanced at him. He'd seen Cal before, a transient face among many. "Just getting supplies," Cal mumbled, keeping his head down. Humph, Hemlock grunted, barely acknowledging him. The few other patrons gave him sidelong glances. Havenwood wasn't a welcoming place. People were wary of outsiders. He felt their eyes on his back, assessing, judging. He grabbed the supplies he needed, trying to appear nonchalant, ignoring the scrutiny. "Here tell there's been some strange things happening up on Blackwood Ridge," a grizzled man in a flannel shirt said, his voice low. Cal froze, pretending to examine a can of beans. "Oh," Cal replied cautiously, careful to keep his tone neutral. The man leaned closer. "Folks saying, strange symbols carved into trees, animals acting funny. Old man Tiberius swore he saw lights in the woods. Said it reminded him of the disappearances back in the 70s. He spat on the floor. Just old wives' tales, I reckon. Disappearances." The word resonated with a disturbing familiarity. Cal's pulse quickened. Disappearances. "Yeah," the man said, shrugging. "3 hikers went missing up there. Never found a trace. Sheriff Brody investigated, but it went cold. Some say it was bears. Some say something else." He winked, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. Cal paid for his supplies, keeping the conversation brief. He needed more information, but he did. T wanted to draw attention to himself. He walked out of the store, the weight of the shopping bag suddenly feeling significant. The sheriff's office was a small, single-story building next to the diner. Cal hesitated before going in. He hadn't had a meaningful interaction with law enforcement in a long time. Sheriff Brody was a large man built like an oak tree, with a face etched with years of quiet responsibility. He was in his 50s. With tired eyes and a permanent frown, he looked up as Cal entered, his gaze assessing. "Can I help you, Brody?" S. voice was gravelly, devoid of warmth. "Just wanted to ask about something," Cal said, choosing his words carefully. "I was hiking up on Blackwood Ridge and came across a marking, a symbol carved into a hunting stand." Brody raised an eyebrow. "A symbol? What kind of symbol?" Cal described the spiral within the circle, sketching it on a notepad. Brody examined it, his expression impassive. "Never seen anything like it," he said finally. "Probably just some kids with too much time on their hands. Vandalism, plain and simple." "It didn't seem like vandalism," Cal insisted. "It felt deliberate, ancient, almost." Brody chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Ancient son, this is Havenwood. The most excitement we get is when a deer wanders onto the highway. Don't go looking for mysteries where there ain't any." Cal pressed on, mentioning the whispers he overheard at the store. The rumors of past disappearances. "People are saying there is something strange going on up there." Brody's face hardened. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but I've been sheriff here for 20 years. I know these woods. We had those disappearances back in 73. But they were just a tragic accident, a bad storm, hikers getting lost. Nothing more, but 3 people all at the same time." Cal persisted. "Sometimes things just happen," Brody said, cutting him off. "Now, unless you have any actual evidence of a crime, I suggest you go enjoy your hike." He turned back to his paperwork, dismissing Cal. Cal felt a surge of frustration. He was hitting a wall. Brody wasn't interested in pursuing anything that might disturb the quiet facade of Havenwood. He thanked Brody curtly and left, feeling more uneasy than ever. He hoped for answers, but he only found indifference and dismissal. He decided to try one last thing. He lingered at the diner, nursing a cup of coffee and eavesdropping on conversations. He learned that old man Tiberius, the man who claimed to have seen lights in the woods, lived on the edge of town, a recluse known for his eccentricities. Cal located Tiberius' cabin, a ramshackle structure hidden behind a screen of overgrown trees. The old man was reluctant to talk at first, but after Cal bought him a bottle of whiskey, he began to ramble, weaving tales of strange occurrences, ancient spirits, and a darkness that lurked in the heart of the forest. Tiberius spoke of a legend, a local myth about a people who worship the spiral, a symbol of cycles, of power of something old. He claimed they vanished centuries ago, leaving behind only whispers and the strange markings. "They say the spiral opens doors." Tiberius slurred, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Doors to places man once meant to go. Doors that should stay closed." Cal listened patiently, dismissing most of it as the ramblings of a senile old man. But a seed of doubt had been planted. He thanked Tiberius and left, the weight of the old man's words pressing on his mind. The drive back to his cabin was filled with a growing sense of dread. The forest seemed to be closing in around him, the trees looming like silent sentinels. He pulled into his clearing, his heart sinking. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The cabin door was slightly ajar, a violation of his meticulously maintained security. His supplies, neatly stacked inside, had been disturbed. Bags ripped open, provisions scattered across the floor. A cold wave of fear washed over him, and then he saw it, hanging from a branch of a pine tree just outside his door. Dead, but it wasn't just a dead ad. It had been deliberately arranged, wings outstretched, in a grotesque imitation of the spiral symbol. Its small, dark eyes stared blankly ahead, fixed on him. A single black feather drifted down, landing at his feet. The crow's image was seared into his mind. It wasn't a random act of malice, it was a message. A taunt he'd spent years erasing himself, becoming a ghost. Now someone was deliberately acknowledging his existence, and doing so with a chilling theatricality. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He spent the rest of the night reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking his weapons, and scanning the perimeter. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He felt exposed, hunted, as dawn broke. Painting the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple, he forced himself to examine the area around the cabin. He found them almost immediately, 20 faint tracks in the soft earth leading away from his property. Heading deeper into the woods, they weren't animal tracks and they weren't made by his boots. They were purposeful, deliberate. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching him. He followed the tracks, his Glock held ready, his senses on high alert. He knew he was walking into a trap, possibly, but he had no choice. Ignoring it wouldn't make it disappear. He had to know who was doing this and why the tracks led him through dense undergrowth, across rocky terrain, and into a part of the forest he'd never ventured before. It was oppressively silent, devoid of birdsong or any sign of life. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. After nearly an hour, the tracks led him to a small, secluded clearing. Hidden behind a thicket of thorny bushes, the clearing was unremarkable, except for a disturbed patch of ground. He pushed aside the bushes, and his stomach lurched. It was a shallow grave, roughly dug, hastily filled. The earth was still loose, dark and damp. He knelt down, his jaw tight, and began to carefully clear away the soil. The first bone he uncovered was a hand, small and delicate, then an arm, a rib cage, the curve of a skull. It was the skeletal remains of a young woman. Years, possibly decades, had passed since her death. But the bones were remarkably well preserved, shielded from the elements by the dense canopy. She wasn't just buried, she was wide arranged. So many wains were positioned in a specific pose, almost ceremonial. Her hands were folded across her chest, and her head was tilted back, as if gazing at the sky. Around her body were objects, findy smooth, gray stones arranged in a circle, a single raven's feather lying across her forehead, and a small, intricately carved wooden doll clutched in her hand. The scene was unsettling, disturbing. It wasn't the work of an animal. It wasn't a random burial. It was a ritual. His military training kicked in. He systematically documented the scene, taking careful notes and photographs. He marked the location with his GPS device, cataloging every detail. He didn't touch anything. He didn't want to contaminate the scene. His hands remained gloved, his movements precise and methodical. He felt numb, detached, as if observing this from outside his own body. It was strangely familiar. Not the specifics, but the cold, calculated precision of the act. It echoed something buried deep within his own past, something he'd spent years trying to suppress. He recognized the meticulous arrangement, the placement of the objects. It wasn't about grief, it was about control, about power, about sending a message. He continued documenting, working quickly, knowing that time was of the essence. He needed to get this reported. He needed to get help. Reluctantly, he pulled out his satellite phone, a last resort he'd hoped never to use. The device took several minutes to establish a connection. When he finally reached Sheriff Brody, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Brody, it is Wallace. Wallace, what do you want?" Brody sounded annoyed. I found something. Up on Blackwood Ridge, a body. There was a moment of silence then. A body? What are you talking about? Cal relayed the details, describing the grave, the skeletal remains, the ritualistic arrangement. Brody's tone shifted from annoyance to grim seriousness. "Stay where you are," he said sharply. "Don't touch anything. I'm on my way." It took Brody nearly 2 hours to reach the clearing. He arrived with two deputies, a grim-faced expression on his face. He surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. This is bad." He and his deputies began a more thorough examination of the site, while Cal stood back, observing. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He wasn't a suspect, not yet, but he knew that Brody would be looking at everyone, including him. He was an outsider, living off the grid with no verifiable history. He was an easy target. Brody walked over to Cal, his expression unreadable. "You said you found this, just wandering around." "I was following tracks," Cal replied, carefully choosing his words. "Tracks leading away from my cabin." Brody nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He signaled to one of his deputies, who began photographing the tracks. As Brody continued his investigation, he noticed something on the victim's exposed forearm. He knelt down, examining the bone more closely. His eyes widened. "What is it?" Cal asked, his voice tight. Brody didn't answer immediately. He looked up, his face pale. "There is something carved into the bone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A symbol." He turned his wrist, revealing the carving. It wasn't faint or obscured by the passage of time. It was clear, deliberate, and undeniably familiar. It was the spiral within the circle. "Sarah Jenkins," Brody said, the name hanging heavy in the air, "disappeared 20 years ago, hiking the Blackwood Ridge with a group of friends. A storm rolled in, they got separated. Her friends made it out, she didn't." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the weariness etched deep into his features. "We searched for weeks. Cadaver dogs, helicopters, nothing. Eventually it went cold, presumed lost to the elements." He glanced at Cal. "Until now." The rain started Sivane, cold, persistent drizzle that turned the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess. It felt appropriate, a fitting accompaniment to the bleakness of the discovery. "Her parents, they're both gone now," Brody continued, his voice softening. "They never gave up hope, but 20 years is a long time. This won't bring them much comfort." The deputies worked efficiently, meticulously documenting the scene, bagging evidence, and setting up a perimeter. Cal stood back, offering assistance where needed, his military training proving invaluable. He pointed out subtle details that the deputies had missed: a faint drag mark in the soil, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss. He helped them establish a grid pattern for the search. Maximizing their coverage of the area, Brody watched him, assessing. "You're good," he admitted grudgingly. "You know your way around the woods." "I've spent a lot of time in them," Cal replied, offering no further explanation. As they worked, fragments of memory surfaced unbidden. A desert landscape, the harsh glare of the sun. A team of men moving through the dunes, shadows stretching long and distorted, the weight of a weapon in his hands. The faces of men he'd known, now lost to time. The smell of dust and despair. He blinked, shoving the images back down. He hadn't thought about that mission in years. He'd buried it deep, along with everything else he'd tried to forget. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This wasn't the time for ghosts. He had a job to do. By nightfall, they'd recovered a few more items from the gravesite: fragments of clothing, a rusted metal buckle, a tarnished silver locket. The locket contained a faded photograph of a smiling young woman with long, dark hair, Sarah Jenkins. She looked full of life, brimming with potential. It was a stark contrast to the skeletal remains they'd uncovered back at the sheriff's office. Brody laid out the original case files, a stack of yellowed documents and faded photographs. The investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Interviews with Sarah's friends, family, and acquaintances had yielded no leads. There were no suspects, no witnesses, no solid evidence. "Everyone thought she just got lost in the storm," Brody said, sighing. "But there were always rumors, whispers about something else." Cal leaned over the files, scanning the witness statements. One name kept recurring: Marcus Hale. He was described as a charismatic, enigmatic figure who had befriended Sarah shortly before her disappearance. He was a leader of a local fringe religious group known as the Shepherds of the Stone. The Shepherds, Cal asked. A weird bunch, Brody said with a dismissive wave of his hand. New Age stuff, nature worship, ancient rituals, that kind of thing. They held meetings out in the woods, claimed to be in touch with spirits. What happened to Hale? He disappeared too, Brody replied. A few months after Sarah. No one ever found him. The group kind of scattered after that, most of them moved on. But there were always stories about strange ceremonies, about sacrifices. He produced a photograph of Marcus Hale, a handsome man with piercing blue eyes and a disarming smile. But there was something unsettling about his gaze, a hint of fanaticism lurking beneath the surface. Beneath the photograph, Brody produced another image. It was a crude drawing hastily sketched on a piece of paper. A symbol. Familiar, it was a stylized representation of a stone tower, with a spiral etched into its side. Cal's blood ran cold. He recognized the symbol. Not from Native American lore, not from historical surveys, he'd seen it before. A long time ago, during his time in the military, a flood of memories washed over him, tained dark corridors, hushed voices, clandestine meetings. He was stationed in Germany, part of a special operations unit tasked with investigating a shadowy organization operating in Eastern Europe. The organization called itself the Ordo Lapidus Esti, the Order of the Stone. They were a dangerous cult, steeped in ancient mysticism, and driven by a twisted ideology. He dismissed it as a relic of the past, a closed chapter in his life. But now, here it was, resurfacing in the remote woods of Washington state, the Shepherds of the Stone. Ordo Lapidus. It was the same symbol. He remembered the briefings, the intelligence reports, the warnings about the cult's obsession with ancient rituals, with power. With sacrifice, they believed the spiral represented a gateway to another dimension, a realm of unimaginable power, and they were willing to do anything to open it. He'd seen the effects of their ideology firsthand, in the brainwashed followers, the acts of violence, the sheer, terrifying fanaticism. He'd thought he'd left that world behind, he'd thought he was safe, but it seemed the past had a way of catching up to you. He stared at the symbol, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of his memories. This wasn't just a local cold case. This was something far bigger, far more dangerous. Where did you get this symbol? He asked. His voice barely a whisper, Brody shrugged. Found it in some of the old case files. Apparently, it was used by the Shepherds of the Stone. They carved it into trees, onto rocks, even onto their own skin. He paused then, looked at Cal with a newfound curiosity. You seem to know a lot about this. Cal didn't answer. He knew he couldn't reveal his past, not yet. It would compromise everything. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that Sarah Jenkins's death wasn't a tragic accident. It was part of something far more sinister, and he had a feeling that he was about to be drawn into a darkness he thought he'd escaped forever. The cabin was hidden deep within a ravine, accessible only by a treacherous, overgrown trail. It looked innocuous enough from a distant weathered single-story structure nestled among the trees. But the silence surrounding it felt wrong, oppressive. This is it, Brody said, his voice low. According to my intel, this is where the remaining members of the Shepherds of the Stone have been gathering. Cal surveyed the area, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid, metallic, like blood. He didn't like it. He didn't like this at all. Let's go over the plan one more time, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We approach from the north using the tree line for cover. Secure the perimeter, then breach the cabin. Expect resistance. Brody nodded, his face grim. I have backup en route, but it'll be at least 30 minutes before they arrive. We're on our own for now. They moved cautiously, weaving through the dense undergrowth, staying low to the ground. Cal took the lead, his military training kicking in, his every step deliberate and precise. He scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of danger. The cabin was eerily quiet, no lights, no sound. It felt abandoned. But Cal knew better. He could feel eyes on them, watching their every move. They reached the edge of the clearing, positioned themselves behind a thick cluster of pine trees, and surveyed the cabin. The windows were boarded up, and the door was reinforced with heavy metal bars. It was clear they weren't expecting visitors. "Breaching in 3-2-1, Cal said, signaling to Brody. He kicked in the door with a swift, powerful blow, splintering the wood and sending the metal bars flying. They rushed inside, weapons drawn, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The cabin was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and something else toying, something ancient, almost primordial. The interior was a chaotic mess. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with esoteric texts and occult paraphernalia. Strange symbols were painted on the floor and walls, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe before their very eyes. In the center of the room, a makeshift altar had been constructed from rough-hewn stones. On the altar lay a collection of disturbing artifacts, animal skulls, dried herbs, and a tarnished silver dagger. "Jesus," Brody muttered, his face pale. "What kind of sick people do this?" Before Cal could answer, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Welcome, seekers of truth." A figure emerged from the darkness, a man in his late 50s with a long gray beard and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in a flowing white robe, and his face was etched with a fanatical intensity. It was Marcus Hale behind him. A dozen figures materialized, armed with hunting knives, clubs, and makeshift weapons. They formed a semicircle around Cal and Brody, their faces impassive, their eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "Marcus Hale," Brody said, his voice tight. "You're under arrest," Hale chuckled, a dry, chilling sound. "Arrest? You speak of earthly laws, Sheriff. We operate on a higher plane of existence. We are preparing for the awakening." "Awakening?" Cal asked, his voice dangerously calm. "The awakening of the old one," Hale replied, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "The ancient power that sleeps beneath these mountains, the power that will cleanse this world and usher in a new age." He gestured towards the altar. "We have been performing the rituals for months, gathering the energy, preparing the vessel." Cal understood now, the disappearances, the symbols, the sacrifices. It wasn't just about power, it was about opening a gateway to something, else something malevolent. "You're insane," Brody said, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Insane." Hale scoffed. "You are the insane ones, blinded by your mundane reality. You cannot comprehend the power that awaits us." Suddenly, one of Hale's followers lunged at Brody, swinging a club. Cal reacted instantly, stepping in front of Brody and deflecting the blow with his forearm. He grabbed the attacker, disarming him with a swift, brutal movement, and slammed him against the wall. "Take cover," Cal shouted. As the other cult members surged forward, chaos erupted. A tense standoff quickly devolved into a brutal firefight. Bullets whizzed through the air, shattering windows and tearing through the wooden walls. Cal moved with lightning speed, using his tactical skills to clear a path for himself. And Brody. He returned fire with deadly accuracy, taking down several of the attackers. Brody, despite his age, was a seasoned lawman. He returned fire with steady precision, dropping 2 more of the cult members, but they were outnumbered, and the attackers were relentless. Cal pushed Brody behind an overturned table for cover. "We need to get out of here," agreed, Brody said, grunting with effort. He was hit in the shoulder, and a crimson stain was spreading across his uniform. As they attempted to retreat, Hale blocked their path, a sinister smile playing on his lips. He raised the silver dagger, its blade gleaming in the flickering candlelight. "You cannot stop the awakening," Hale said, his voice filled with religious fervor. "The old one will rise, and this world will tremble before its power." He lunged at Brody, but Cal intervened, tackling Hale to the ground. They wrestled for control of the dagger, the blade flashing dangerously close to their faces. Cal managed to disarm Hale, but not before the cult leader landed a powerful blow to his head. A wave of dizziness washed over Cal, and his vision blurred. He staggered backwards, momentarily disoriented. Hale seized the opportunity, scrambling to his feet and leveling a pistol at Brody. Before Cal could react, Hale fired. Brody cried out in pain, clutching his chest. He slumped to the ground, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "No," Cal shouted, his voice filled with rage. He opened fire on Hale, sending a barrage of bullets ripping through the air. Hale screamed and fell to the ground, lifeless. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining cult members, emboldened by their leader's death, renewed their attack. Cal knew they were hopelessly outnumbered. He had to get Brody out of there, Brody. He shouted, trying to reach him, but it was too late. The deputies were still 30 minutes away, and Brody was bleeding badly. He made a split-second decision. He grabbed Brody, dragging him towards the back of the cabin. He kicked out a window and helped Brody through, lowering him onto the ground outside. "Get to safety," Cal yelled. "I'll cover you." He turned back to face the remaining cult members, firing his weapon until it was empty. He knew he couldn't hold them off for long. He ditched his weapon and fled into the wilderness, disappearing into the dense forest. The cult members hot on his trail. The sound of gunfire faded behind him, replaced by the pounding of his heart and the crushing weight of despair. He'd failed. He'd failed to save Brody, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the awakening was still coming. The forest was his sanctuary, his shield. He moved through it like a phantom, a shadow slipping between the trees. Years of training had honed his instincts, allowing him to anticipate the cultist movements, to read the subtle signs of their pursuit. He didn't run in straight lines. That was for amateurs. He looped, doubled back, crisscrossed his own tracks, utilizing the terrain to his advantage. He set rudimentary traps, Sivanite tripwires connected to noisemakers, sharpened sticks hidden in the undergrowth thivandine, designed not to kill, but to slow them down, to buy him time. He'd lost his weapon, his supplies. All he had was his training, his wits, and the growing certainty that he was the only one who could stop them. He found Brody a few hundred yards from the cabin, propped against a fallen log, his face pale and slick with sweat. The wound to his chest was severe, bleeding profusely. Cal ripped off his own shirt and used it to apply pressure to the wound. Improvising a makeshift bandage, Brody groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Cal, you shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Couldn't leave you," Cal replied, his voice gruff. He administered the last of the antibiotic ointment from his first aid kit, a relic from a life he tried to leave behind. It wouldn't be enough. Brody needed medical attention, and fast. He knew he couldn't carry Brody far, and calling for help was out of the question. It would only lead the cultists back to them. He found a small cave, hidden behind a waterfall, and moved Brody inside. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some protection from the elements. He spent the next several hours tending to Brody's wounds, rationing his dwindling water supply, and trying to keep him conscious. He fought off waves of guilt and self-doubt. He should have been faster. He should have been more prepared. He should have been better. The memories came flooding back, vivid, brutal, inescapable, the desert, the heat, the faces of his team, young, hopeful, trusting, the ambush, the chaos, the gunfire, the screams. He'd been the team leader. He'd been responsible for their safety. And he'd failed. A botched operation in Syria, a misguided intelligence report, a target that wasn't what they'd been led to believe, a village full of innocent civilians. He'd ordered the strike. He'd given the command. The images replayed themselves endlessly in his mind, forwarding the burning buildings, the mangled bodies, the faces of the children. He tried to block it out, to bury it deep within his subconscious, but it always resurfaced, haunting his dreams, poisoning his waking hours. He'd resigned his commission shortly after the incident, disappearing without a trace. He'd wanted to escape the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that he was responsible for the deaths of those men. He'd sought solace in isolation, hoping to find some semblance of peace in the wilderness. But peace remained elusive. It seemed the past had a way of catching up with you. While tending to Brody, he'd found a tattered calendar in the sheriff's jacket pocket. Marked in red was a date 3 days from now, and scrawled beneath it, "Lunar eclipse." It clicked into place. The rituals hadn't been random. They were timed to coincide with the eclipse, a period when the veil between worlds was believed to be at its thinnest. The cultists believed the eclipse would amplify their power, allowing them to complete the awakening. He needed to stop them. He needed to disrupt the ceremony. But how? He was outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. He examined the symbol again, finna the spiral within the circle. He remembered reading about the cult's beliefs finna there. Obsession with ancient mythology, their reverence for the old ones, their belief that the spiral represented a gateway to another dimension. They believed the old ones possessed unimaginable power, power that could be harnessed to reshape the world in their image. And he remembered something else, 20 detail from one of the intelligence reports he'd read during his time in the military. The cultists believed the ritual required a sacrifice, a willing offering, someone pure of heart. He had an idea. A dangerous, desperate idea. It relied on understanding their beliefs, on exploiting their fanaticism, but it was his only chance. He knew the cultists were likely preparing for the final ceremony at the highest point in the region, fighting Blackwood Peak, a treacherous, desolate mountain peak shrouded in mist and legends. He had to get there first. Leaving Brody in the relative safety of the cave, he set out, moving swiftly and silently through the forest. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he didn't care. He was prepared to make whatever sacrifice was necessary to stop them. He navigated through dense forests, scaled rocky cliffs, and crossed raging streams, pushing his body to the limit. He channeled his pain, his guilt, his rage, transforming them into fuel. As he neared Blackwood Peak, he saw them. The cultists, by dozens of them turning, gathered around a massive stone altar, bathed in the eerie glow of the setting sun. They were chanting, their voices rising in a hypnotic drone, and in the center of the altar, bound and gagged, was a young woman. He recognized her. Sarah Jenkins's niece, Emily. The ritual was about to begin. Cal took a deep breath, steeled his resolve, and prepared for the final showdown. He was a broken man haunted by his past, but he was also a warrior, and he wouldn't let them sacrifice another innocent on the altar of their madness. The air crackled with energy as Cal descended upon the ritual site. The cultists, startled by his sudden appearance, turned towards him, their eyes filled with a fanatical rage. He didn't hesitate. He moved with the speed and precision of a predator, targeting the closest attackers, a flurry of punches, kicks, and elbows. He disarmed them with ruthless efficiency, using their own momentum against them. He wasn't trying to kill them, but he wasn't holding back either. He needed to create chaos to disrupt the ceremony. The cult leader, a man named Silas Thorn, a direct descendant of Marcus Hale Thundy, lunged at him, a silver dagger flashing in his hand. Cal parried the blow, the force of the impact jarring his arm. Thorn was strong, surprisingly agile for his age. He fought with a desperate fury fueled by religious zealotry. "You cannot stop the inevitable," Thorn screamed, his voice hoarse. "The old ones will rise, and this world will be remade in their image." Cal didn't respond. He focused on the fight, blocking Thorn's attacks, searching for an opening. Their movements were a brutal dance of life and death, the clash of steel echoing through the mountains. He remembered his training, years of honing his skills, of pushing his body and mind to the limit. It was a long time ago, a different life, but the muscle memory remained. He feinted to the left, then struck with a lightning-fast right hook, connecting with Thorn's jaw. The cult leader staggered backwards, momentarily stunned. Cal pressed his advantage, launching a series of relentless attacks. He disarmed Thorn, sending the dagger clattering across the stone floor. He pinned the cult leader to the ground, his knee pressing into his chest. "It is over," Cal said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You think so?" Thorn spat, a trickle of blood running down his chin. "This is just the beginning. The awakening has been set in motion. It cannot be stopped." Cal ignored him. He focused his attention on the altar. He'd noticed a series of intricately carved runes surrounding the stone, runes that seemed to be channeling energy towards the center of the platform. He recognized them from the intelligence reports he'd read years ago. Symbols used to amplify psychic energy, to open gateways to other dimensions. He had to disrupt the flow of energy. He ripped the silver locket from Sarah Jenkins's niece, Emily, her eyes wide with fear. He smashed it against the stone altar, shattering the glass and scattering the fragments. Then, using the jagged edge of a broken piece of pottery, he began to deface the runes, scratching away at the intricate carvings. As he did so, the chanting of the cult members faltered, their voices losing their hypnotic rhythm. A wave of energy pulsed through the cave, causing the ground to tremble. The air grew thick with static. The cave began to collapse, rocks rained down from the ceiling. Dust filled the air, and the altar started to crumble. Panic erupted among the cultists. They screamed and scattered, desperately trying to escape the collapsing cave. Cal released Thorn, knowing he had to get Emily to safety. He grabbed her arm and dragged her towards the entrance, dodging falling debris. Thorn, meanwhile, struggled to his feet, his eyes burning with rage. "You have doomed us all." he shrieked, lunging at Cal with renewed fury. They grappled again, wrestling for control. Thorn managed to land a blow to Cal's head, sending him reeling. But Cal refused to give up. He used his remaining strength to throw Thorn against a rock wall, knocking him unconscious. He dragged Emily out of the cave just as the entrance collapsed, sealing the remaining cultists inside. The ground shook violently, and the entire mountain seemed to groan in protest. He turned to see Brody stumbling towards them, leaning heavily on his arm. He'd managed to escape the cave on his own. "You, all right, Sheriff?" Cal asked, his voice strained. "Just a little shaken up," Brody replied. "Wincing in pain, you saved my life, Cal. I owe you one." "Don't mention it," Cal said, helping Brody to his feet. They stumbled away from the collapsing cave, the dust and debris swirling around them. As they reached a safe distance, they looked back to see the peak of Blackwood Mountain shrouded in smoke and shadow. The immediate threat was over, but Cal knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly finished. Thorn had spoken of a prophecy, of a future awakening, of the old ones returning to claim their dominion over the world. He hadn't been able to learn the specifics before the fight, only snippets and fragments of Thorn's rambling, but he knew instinctively that the cult believed this wasn't the end. Just a setback. They'd been preparing for this for centuries, and they wouldn't give up easily months later. Cal remained in his cabin, living a solitary existence. He'd patched up his wounds, both physical and emotional. He'd helped Brody with the investigation, providing evidence that led to the arrest of several remaining cult members. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He'd tried to return to his previous life, to find some semblance of normalcy, but he couldn't. It was as if a part of him had been forever changed by his experiences. He'd found a fragile peace, but it was a peace tinged with unease one day. While checking his perimeter, he noticed something strange carved into the bark of a pine tree. Near the edge of his property was a symbol, a perfect circle with a spiral winding inward. His blood ran cold. He recognized it instantly. It wasn't a relic from the past. It was new, freshly carved. He looked around, scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing there, only the silence. The spiral symbol. It was a warning, a promise, a chilling reminder that the darkness hadn't been vanquished. It was merely waiting, and he knew, with a sinking feeling, that he would be called upon again. The stone still held its secrets, and the shadows were gathering once more.